October 1945. A small German town in the American occupation zone. The war has been over for 5 months, but the ground still looks unfinished. Roofless houses line the street like broken teeth. Brick dust lingers in the air, stirred by boots and wheels. Where a school once stood, there's a hollowed shell, its classrooms open to the sky by high explosive bombs dropped only a year earlier. Children stand nearby, quiet, watching. An American Army truck rolls in slowly, its tires crunching over rubble. There are no weapons in the back, no ammunition crates. Instead, wooden desks, chalkboards, bundles of paper tied with string. A folded U.S. Army flag flutters against the side panel. The same uniform that once arrived with bombers now steps down carrying textbooks. German townspeople observe from doorways and shattered windows. They do not cheer. They do not protest. Many simply stare, unable to reconcile memory with reality. These were the forces that destroyed their streets from the air. Now they are measuring walls, clearing debris, and marking rooms for lessons. In the ruins of total war, something unexpected is beginning, not with treaties or speeches, but with classrooms. And to understand how this moment became possible, the story must return to how those ruins were created in the first place. By the time American soldiers were unloading desks in German towns, the destruction around them had been years in the making. The Allied bombing campaign against Germany did not begin as an effort to destroy schools or neighborhoods. It began as a strategic calculation. In 1942 and 1943, as the war expanded and casualties mounted across Europe, Allied planners increasingly believed that air power could shorten the conflict. Factories, rail yards, oil refineries, and industrial cities became targets. The logic was industrial, not personal. Break Germany's ability to wage war, and the war would end sooner. For the United States Army Air Forces, this doctrine centered on daylight precision bombing. American commanders argued that high-altitude formations of B-17 Flying Fortresses and B-24 Liberators, guided by advanced bomb sights, could strike military and industrial targets while limiting civilian casualties. In theory, it was controlled. In practice, weather, smoke, anti-aircraft fire, and human error turned precision into approximation. Cities absorbed the consequences. From 1943 onward, German Aben centers were struck repeatedly. Hamburg burned in the summer of 1943. Berlin endured sustained attacks through 1944 and early 1945. Medium and small towns, places with rail junctions, storage depots, or nearby factories, were hit as well. Bombs did not distinguish between an armaments workshop and the school next door. Shockwaves collapsed walls indiscriminately. Firestorms erased entire districts. Schools, often large masonry buildings near town centers, were especially vulnerable. By late 1944, the situation inside Germany had become severe. Millions were displaced. Children were evacuated to the countryside when possible. Lessons were interrupted, moved to basements, barns, or abandoned halls. Many schools simply ceased to function. Teachers were conscripted. Older students were pulled into labor details or Volkssturm units. Education became secondary to survival. American air crews rarely saw this aftermath. From 30,000 feet, towns appeared as grid patterns and smoke columns. Mission reports recorded tonnage dropped, targets hit, aircraft lost. The human geography below was abstracted into coordinates. When bombers returned to England or Italy, the crews moved on to the next briefing, the next map, the next target. On the ground, German civilians endured a different reality. By early 1945, food shortages were widespread. Fuel was scarce. Transportation networks were fractured. In many towns, administrative order barely functioned. Local officials struggled to maintain records, distribute aid, or even communicate with regional authorities. As Allied armies closed in from the west and the Red Army advanced from the east, entire communities prepared for occupation without knowing what occupation would mean. When Germany surrendered in May 1945, there was no gradual transition. The regime collapsed abruptly. Nazi institutions dissolved. Ministries vanished. Police forces disintegrated or were disarmed. Schools, where they still existed, were closed by default. The ideology that had shaped curricula for 12 years was now illegal, and there was no approved replacement ready to take its place. In the American zone of occupation, stretching from Bavaria through Hesse and Wittenberg-Baden, U.S. commanders were suddenly responsible not only for security, but for civil life. Roads had to function, food had to be distributed, disease had to be contained, and millions of children, many of whom had known nothing but war, were without classrooms, teachers, or structure. The bombers had done their work. The war was over. But victory had left behind a question the bombs had never been designed to answer. What should rise in the spaces they had destroyed? That question would soon push American forces into a role they had not anticipated, one that began not with rebuilding factories or bridges, but with deciding what German children would learn when the doors of schools finally opened again. The collapse of Nazi Germany created a vacuum that extended far beyond military defeat. When the surrender was signed on May 7, 1945, the state that had governed German life for over a decade ceased to function almost overnight. Ministries dissolved. Party offices were abandoned. Local administrations, long bound to Nazi oversight, found themselves paralyzed, unsure who was permitted to give orders, or whether giving orders at all was still allowed. Into this void stepped the occupying powers. Germany was divided into 4 zones, each administered by a different allied nation. The United States assumed control over a broad southern region. Responsibility fell to the Office of Military Government, United States, OMGS. Its mandate was clear in theory and overwhelming in practice: maintain order, prevent famine and disease, dismantle Nazism, and prepare the ground for a democratic future. Education became central to that mission almost immediately. American planners understood that schools under the Third Reich had not been neutral spaces. Textbooks had carried racial doctrine. History lessons had been shaped to legitimize conquest. Biology classes had been infused with ideology. Teachers were state functionaries, many of them party members by requirement or convenience. To reopen schools without reform would risk perpetuating the very system the war had been fought to destroy. As a result, U.S. military authorities ordered all German schools closed in the immediate aftermath of surrender. It was a deliberate pause. Buildings were inspected. Teachers were screened. Curricula were reviewed or discarded. In towns where school structures still stood, American officers walked through classrooms filled with rubble, broken glass, and outdated slogans painted on walls. Condition of these buildings reflected the broader state of the country. Bomb damage was widespread, but even undamaged schools lacked heat, electricity, and supplies. Desks had been burned for fuel during the winter. Books were scarce. Paper was rationed. In many towns, a single usable room had to serve dozens of children in rotating shifts. The human cost was just as severe. Millions of children had lost parents. Many were malnourished. Psychological trauma was common, though not yet named as such. Teachers, when available, were often exhausted, compromised by past affiliations, or both. American authorities faced a dilemma: delay education until ideal conditions existed, or begin immediately in imperfect circumstances. They chose to begin. By late summer and autumn of 1945, OMGS issued directives to restart elementary education wherever possible. The focus was basic: reading, writing, arithmetic. Political content was stripped away. Nazi-era textbooks were banned, collected, and destroyed. New materials, often hastily printed or imported, were introduced. In some cases, American officers themselves helped translate or distribute content. The symbolism of this shift was unmistakable. The same military government that had enforced curfews and requisitioned buildings was now supervising classrooms. Soldiers accustomed to checkpoints and patrols found themselves escorting school inspectors or unloading educational supplies. In towns that had been struck by American bombs, American hands were now clearing debris from schoolyards. German reactions varied. Some parents were cautious, unsure of the occupiers' intentions. Others were relieved to see any return to normalcy. For many children, the reopening of schools marked the first structured rhythm of life since air raid sirens had dominated their days. This was not an act of charity. It was policy. American officials believed that education would determine whether Germany emerged as a stable society or collapsed into resentment and extremism. Schools were viewed as instruments of long-term security. Rebuilding them was as strategic as rebuilding roads. Yet on the ground, the effect felt personal. In towns where bomb craters still scarred playgrounds, the presence of American-sponsored classrooms forced civilians to confront a contradiction. The power that had destroyed their homes was now investing in their children's future. That contradiction would be felt differently depending on where one stood. by a mother watching her child return to class, by a soldier overseeing reconstruction, or by a teacher navigating a new moral landscape. Those differing perspectives form the angles through which this story must now be understood. Angle 1, the human angle, civilians and children in the ruins. For German civilians, the reopening of schools was not experienced as a political program. It was felt as interruption. For years, daily life had been governed by air raid warnings, shortages, and loss. Children learned to identify aircraft silhouettes before they learned multiplication. Education, when it occurred at all, was fragmented and fragile. Many families no longer expected classrooms to return. When American authorities announced that schools would reopen, reactions were cautious. Parents inspected buildings themselves, stepping over broken stone and charred beams to judge whether the walls would hold. Some children arrived barefoot. Others carried nothing at all. No books, no notebooks, only the expectation that something might begin again. Inside these improvised classrooms, silence replaced noise. There were no slogans on the walls anymore. Portraits of Hitler were gone. In their place were blank spaces, sometimes literal, sometimes psychological. Teachers avoided politics. Lessons focused on structure and routine. For children who had known only instability, the act of sitting at a desk became grounding. This was not gratitude. It was adjustment. Many civilians struggled with the emotional reversal. The aircraft that had shattered their homes were American. The soldiers now protecting school buildings were American. The same insignia marked both experiences. Understanding that distinction took time, especially for those who had buried relatives beneath the rubble. Yet for the youngest generation, memory was shorter. They adapted quickly. The school bell, however improvised, became a sound of continuity. And continuity, in 1945 Germany, was rare. Angle 2, the military angle. Soldiers turned administrators for American soldiers. Post-war Germany was not what they had trained for. Most had been prepared for combat, not governance. Their manuals covered patrol formations, weapons maintenance, and battlefield discipline. Now they were reading directives on education policy, teacher vetting, and curriculum approval. The transition was abrupt. Military government officers, often with backgrounds in law or administration, were assigned to towns and districts. Enlisted men provided logistical support. Trucks that once carried ammunition now transported desks and blackboards. Warehouses were repurposed to store school supplies instead of rations. This shift carried its own tension. Soldiers were still responsible for security. Weapons remained slung over shoulders even as classrooms reopened nearby. In some towns, schools shared buildings with military offices. The presence of armed foreigners in educational spaces underscored the abnormality of peace. Yet many soldiers recognized the importance of the task. Reports from the period show growing awareness that education was preventative, that it might stop future wars rather than win the last one. Supervising a school inspection did not bring medals, but it offered something the battlefield rarely did: visible, constructive progress. The war had taught these men how to destroy infrastructure efficiently. Occupation taught them how fragile civilization was without it. Angle 3, the psychological angle. From enemy to authority, the psychological impact of American-built schools was profound precisely because it was unexpected. Occupation, in historical memory, often implies punishment, reprisals, humiliation. German civilians anticipated restrictions, not investment. The decision to prioritize education challenged those assumptions. For adults, this created cognitive dissonance. The occupiers controlled movement, censored media, and dismantled familiar institutions. At the same time, they were reopening classrooms and emphasizing the welfare of children. These actions did not align with older models of conquest. For children, the shift was even more disorienting. Uniforms that had once been associated with air raids were now present at school entrances. Authority figures spoke a foreign language but enforced rules with consistency. Discipline was firm, but predictable. This predictability mattered. Psychologists working in post-war Europe later noted that routine was essential in stabilizing traumatized populations. At the time, American officials understood this intuitively. Schools imposed schedules, expectations, and limits. They restored a sense of future. Not all Germans accepted this easily. Suspicion remained. Some viewed educational reforms as reprogramming. Others feared cultural erasure. But over time, the act of learning itself softened resistance. When a former enemy invests in your children, the war does not end immediately, but its meaning begins to change. That shift would deepen as American authorities moved beyond basic reopening and began reshaping what German education would become. Angle 4. The educational angle. Why schools came first. American emphasis on reopening German schools was not improvised. It was rooted in pre-war studies and wartime planning that treated education as a strategic variable. U.S. policymakers had examined the failures of post-World War I occupation. They believed that economic hardship and ideological neglect had allowed extremism to regenerate. In 1945, they aimed to intervene earlier and more directly. Schools became the entry point. Elementary education was prioritized because it was seen as foundational and politically malleable. Younger children had been exposed to less indoctrination. Teaching them neutral skills, literacy, numeracy, civic basics, was viewed as an investment in long-term stability. Secondary education and universities would follow later, under stricter oversight. Curriculum reform focused on subtraction rather than addition. Nazi ideology was removed, but American values were not overtly imposed. Textbooks avoided nationalism altogether. History lessons were delayed or carefully reframed. Emphasis was placed on factual accuracy, critical thinking, and moral responsibility without overt propaganda. This restraint was deliberate. American officials understood that education perceived as occupation indoctrination would fail. Schools had to appear German, even under American supervision. That balance, control without visibility, defined the educational strategy of the occupation. Angle 5. The political angle. Denazification through classrooms. Denazification is often remembered through trials and dismissals. In practice, it was quieter and more pervasive. Teachers were among the first civilian professions screened by American authorities. Party membership records were examined. Past affiliations were assessed. In many cases, teachers were suspended not for crimes, but for credibility. The goal was not punishment, but prevention. This created shortages. Entire faculties were dismissed at once. In some towns, only a handful of teachers remained. American authorities allowed provisional appointments, often favoring those with minimal party involvement or those who had been sidelined under the Nazi system. Schools thus became filters. Who was allowed to teach determined what could be taught. Classrooms became spaces where the old order was silently replaced. Political neutrality was enforced strictly. Discussions of Nazism were limited. Symbolism was regulated. Even maps were reviewed to ensure they did not reflect territorial claims. This process was slow and imperfect. Some compromised individuals returned due to necessity. Others were permanently excluded. But over time, the composition of the teaching profession changed. Denazification, in this form, was not dramatic. It was administrative, and it was effective precisely because it unfolded quietly, lesson by lesson. Angle 6. The moral angle. Responsibility after victory. The moral dimension of rebuilding German schools cannot be separated from American self-perception after the war. Victory brought power, and power raised questions. What obligations did a victor have toward the defeated? Was punishment sufficient, or was reconstruction required? American leadership increasingly argued that responsibility did not end with surrender. Building schools and bombed towns was an acknowledgement of causality. The bombs had destroyed civilian infrastructure. Restoring it was not an act of forgiveness. It was an acceptance of consequence. This moral logic distinguished the American approach from simple occupation. Schools symbolized restraint. They suggested that force had limits, and that peace demanded investment. For German civilians, this message was ambiguous but unavoidable. The occupiers were not retreating. They were reshaping. This moral framing would reach its most visible point when reopened schools transitioned from emergency measures into permanent institutions, no longer provisional, no longer symbolic, but integrated into a new German reality. That transition marked the true turning point of the story. The turning point did not arrive with a single announcement or ceremony. It emerged gradually, across dozens of towns, as temporary classrooms became permanent fixtures of daily life. By the winter of 1945, emergency education had reached its limits. Children were attending school in shifts, often for only a few hours a day. Buildings lacked heating. Lessons were conducted in coats and gloves. Yet attendance increased steadily. Parents adjusted schedules. Teachers adapted. What had begun as a provisional measure was becoming expected. American military government officers took notice. In early 1946, directives shifted in tone. Schools were no longer described as temporary necessities but as institutions requiring stabilization and expansion. Funds were allocated specifically for repairs. Engineers were assigned to assess structural integrity. In some towns, American units assisted in clearing rubble not to restore roads, but to reopen school wings. This was a decisive change. The moment American resources were committed beyond survival-level education, the occupation entered a new phase. Reconstruction was no longer reactive. It was intentional. Reopening a school after bombardment was complex. Walls had to be reinforced, roofs replaced, windows repaired with salvaged glass, heating systems rebuilt from scrap. Each decision required approval. Each material had to be sourced in a devastated economy. American authorities coordinated with local German administrators who had passed screening. This collaboration was cautious but functional. German engineers provided knowledge of buildings. American officers provided authority and materials. The process forced cooperation between former enemies at a practical level. Children noticed the difference before adults did. Classes became longer. Supplies improved incrementally. Chalk replaced charcoal. Exercise books appeared, thin but clean. In some schools, bells were repaired or replaced. These were small changes, but they signaled permanence. For many townspeople, this permanence was unsettling. The idea that the Americans were not leaving quickly altered how occupation was perceived. Schools were not something one built for a short stay. They implied commitment. They suggested that the future of these towns mattered to the occupiers. This perception deepened when American officials began overseeing not just buildings, but content. Teacher training seminars were introduced. New educational guidelines were circulated. Inspectors observed classes and filed reports. The presence of Americans in educational spaces became routine. At the same time, skepticism persisted. Some Germans questioned whether this was a strategy to reshape identity. Others resented that the same power responsible for destruction now claimed authority over reconstruction. These tensions surfaced in local meetings and private conversations, though rarely in open defiance. What mattered most, however, was continuity. Children advanced from one grade to the next. Teachers resumed professional identities. Parents began to plan beyond immediate survival. Education reintroduced the concept of future time, a future measured in semesters and school years rather than air raid intervals. American soldiers, too, felt the shift. Military reports from the period increasingly referenced schools alongside infrastructure. Education became a metric of stability. A town with functioning schools was considered more secure, less volatile. Schools reduced idle youth. They restored civilian rhythms. By mid-1946, the reopening of schools in the American zone was no longer an experiment. It was policy with momentum. Yet the most decisive moment had not yet arrived. The true test would come when emergency oversight gave way to structured reform, when schools stopped merely existing and began embodying a new educational philosophy. That transition would determine whether American-built classrooms were temporary repairs or foundations for a different Germany. The decisive shift occurred not when schools reopened, but when they were allowed to endure without constant American intervention. By late 1946, the U.S. military government began transferring limited educational authority back to German administrators who had passed extensive vetting. This was a calculated risk. It acknowledged that long-term stability could not be imposed indefinitely from outside. German institutions had to function on their own, even under supervision. The handover was gradual and uneven. In some towns, school boards were reconstituted with provisional members. In others, American officers retained oversight but reduced daily involvement. Inspections became less frequent. Reports shifted from operational details to educational outcomes. This change marked the psychological turning point for civilians. As German teachers resumed responsibility, schools ceased to feel like occupation instruments and began to feel local again. Buildings repaired under American authority now flew no flags at all. Classrooms operated quietly. The presence of U.S. soldiers became peripheral. The memory of bombing did not vanish, but it no longer defined every interaction. One of the most significant developments was the formal rejection of authoritarian pedagogy. Corporal punishment, once common, was discouraged. Rote ideological instruction was eliminated. Students were encouraged to ask questions, carefully at first, then more freely. This pedagogical shift was subtle but profound. American education advisors did not impose a single model. Instead, they emphasized principles, decentralization, accountability, and moral responsibility. These ideas filtered slowly into classrooms through teacher training and revised guidelines. The impact was cumulative. By the start of the 1946 to 1947 school year, attendance rates had stabilized. Schools operated on predictable schedules. Parents no longer viewed enrollment as temporary. Education was once again a baseline expectation, rather than an emergency accommodation. For German townspeople, this created a reckoning. The Americans had not only ended the war, they had altered the trajectory of civilian life in places they had once bombed. This dual legacy, destruction followed by reconstruction, forced a reassessment of what occupation meant. Some Germans continued to resist internally. Others accepted pragmatically. A growing number acknowledged that without American intervention, schooling might have remained fragmented for years. What made this moment decisive was its irreversibility. Once schools functioned independently, the occupation entered a new moral phase. Reconstruction was no longer symbolic. It had produced institutions that could survive the occupier's eventual departure. The transformation was not dramatic. There were no parades, no declarations, just the steady continuation of lessons. And in that continuation, the meaning of the war shifted again. The question was no longer how Germany had been defeated, but what kind of society would emerge in the space left behind. The answer was being written not in treaties, but in classrooms filled with children who no longer associated learning exclusively with ideology or faith. The consequences of that shift would extend far beyond the American occupation zone, shaping German society for decades to come. Those consequences formed the story's aftermath. By 1947, the reopening and stabilization of schools in the American occupation zone had produced measurable results. Reports compiled by the Office of Military Government showed that the majority of elementary schools in U.S.-controlled regions were functioning at some level. While conditions remained uneven, attendance had become routine rather than exceptional. Millions of children were again receiving formal instruction, often for the first time in years. The physical landscape told part of the story. In towns once defined by craters and collapsed roofs, school buildings stood repaired or partially rebuilt. Some retained scars, patched walls, mismatched windows, but they were recognizable as institutions. Schoolyards, though often small and damaged, were reclaimed spaces where children gathered without fear of sirens. Equally significant were the structural reforms embedded within the system. Teacher screening had permanently altered the profession. Many educators associated with Nazi organizations were excluded long-term. Others returned under probationary conditions. A new generation of teachers, some trained during the occupation, entered classrooms with different expectations. Authority was no longer tied to ideology. Instruction was increasingly standardized around skills rather than loyalty. Curriculum oversight remained strict, but its purpose evolved. Rather than simply removing prohibited content, authorities focused on consistency and quality. Textbooks were approved regionally. Civic education emphasized constitutional principles without referencing specific political parties. History was taught cautiously, often limited to pre-1914 periods until consensus could be established. These decisions slowed instruction, but they also prevented relapse. German administrators gradually assumed greater responsibility. Education ministries re-emerged at the state level, aligned with democratic federalism rather than centralized control. American influence persisted, but it was institutional rather than direct. The social effects were visible. Schools provided stability in communities still struggling with housing shortages and food rationing. Children attending classes were less likely to roam streets or engage in black market activity. Parents reported improved morale. The predictability of school schedules allowed families to rebuild routines. For American officials, these outcomes validated their approach. Education had proven to be an effective stabilizer. It reduced tension, mitigated resentment, and facilitated cooperation between occupiers and civilians. This did not erase memory. Bombing raids were not forgotten. Losses were not forgiven automatically. But the relationship between Germans and Americans became more complex than victor and defeated. Schools had transformed that relationship. They had created spaces where power was exercised quietly, where influence was sustained rather than imposed. The long-term consequences of this approach would extend beyond immediate recovery. They would shape the political and social foundation of the emerging West German state. As Germany moved toward political reorganization, the educational reforms initiated under American occupation began to integrate into a broader national framework. By 1948, the division between occupation policy and German self-administration had narrowed. Education ministries within the emerging Länder assumed formal control of schools, inheriting systems shaped by occupation-era decisions. What had begun as American directives now operated as German policy. This continuity mattered. The structure of post-war education reinforced federalism. Authority rested with regional governments rather than a central ministry, reducing the risk of ideological uniformity. Schools reflected local contexts while adhering to shared democratic principles. This decentralization was intentional, informed by the failures of centralized control under the Nazi regime. The generational impact was profound. Children who entered classrooms in 1945 and 1946 reached adulthood in a society fundamentally different from the one their parents had known. Their education emphasized accountability, factual inquiry, and civic responsibility. While not free of influence, it was markedly less ideological. This generation would become voters, professionals, and leaders in the Federal Republic of Germany. The symbolic weight of American-built and American-repaired schools also endured. In towns that had been bombed by U.S. aircraft, the memory of Reconstruction complicated narratives of victimhood and blame. The occupiers had not withdrawn after destruction. They had remained, invested, and accepted responsibility. This dual legacy shaped German-American relations. Cooperation through education softened hostility. It created channels of trust. It humanized the occupation in ways military presence alone could not. Over time, schools became among the least contested institutions of the post-war order. This foundation intersected with larger initiatives. The Marshall Plan, launched in 1947, provided economic recovery. Education ensured that recovery was sustainable. Skilled, educated citizens could participate in rebuilding industries and democratic institutions. Together, these efforts accelerated stabilization in West Germany. By the early 1950s, many schools rebuilt or reopened under American supervision were indistinguishable from those elsewhere in Europe. Their origins during occupation faded into administrative history, but their influence remained embedded in curriculum structure, teacher training, and governance models. The aftermath of American involvement in German education was not uniform success. Inequalities persisted. Resources varied. Debates over history and responsibility continued for decades. Yet one outcome was clear. Education had transformed from a casualty of war into a cornerstone of peace. In towns once reduced to rubble by bombing, classrooms had become sites of continuity rather than collapse. The story now turns from consequence to meaning. What this transformation revealed about warfare, power, and the obligations that follow victory. The reconstruction of German schools after the devastation of Allied bombing was more than a practical measure. It was a statement about the responsibilities of power, the limits of destruction, and the possibilities inherent in rebuilding. Where bombs had torn walls and silenced classrooms, American occupation forces laid the foundations for continuity, learning, and the cautious revival of civic life. Victory, in this context, was inseparable from obligation. The same forces that had leveled towns now measured walls, replaced roofs, and delivered books. In doing so, they transformed the very meaning of occupation. Civilians were no longer only subjects of control, they became participants in recovery. Children, who had lived under fear and scarcity, experienced structure, routine, and a glimpse of normalcy. The moral weight of this act, repairing what had been destroyed, cannot be understated. It demonstrated that reconstruction could be as decisive as destruction, and that influence exerted through education could outlast the physical might of artillery or aircraft. This episode also offers a broader lesson about the aftermath of conflict. War leaves more than ruins. It leaves questions of responsibility, authority, and trust. The decision to prioritize schools reflected a long-term vision, a society educated in fact, disciplined in routine, and shielded from the ideologies that had driven the conflict. The impact was generational. Those children would grow up with the first memories of peace intertwined with the presence of former enemies acting as educators and administrators. Ultimately, The story of German townspeople witnessing Americans rebuild schools reminds us that history is shaped not only by battles won or lost, but by the choices made in the aftermath. It is a lesson in restraint, foresight, and the quiet power of rebuilding. In bombed streets and repaired classrooms alike, the war's shadow lingered, but so did the possibility of a society choosing knowledge, responsibility, and reconciliation over revenge. In the ruins of war, learning became a bridge from devastation to hope, a tangible proof that the tools of destruction can, if wielded differently, create the foundations of a lasting peace.